The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So there's been a lot of discussion about would Democrats try to impeach Donald Trump if they take over the House in the November midterms, which are now just 4.5 weeks away, I guess. But there's another, well, obviously there are other things that Democrats could do if they take over the House in November. And one of those is that they are setting up potentially, if they do take over the House, to start a number of healthcare related investigations into decisions that have been made by the Trump administration. And one of the things they would immediately try to do is to stop the unraveling of Obamacare that is happening and is planned to happen based on the decisions that have been made by the Trump administration. They also want to look into the administration's care or lack of care with regard to these immigrant children at the border who have been detained and who have been the subject of a lot of news stories. And I think that it's really important when we consider why it is that we vote and why it is that if you are on the left, even if you see the Democratic Party as far too moderate or to the right of where you are, why it's important that we get out there and vote. The impeachment of Donald Trump has always been unlikely. It's extraordinarily difficult to not reelect a sitting president when they run for reelection, never mind to impeach a sitting president. So I do think that it's a good idea, Pat, to be aware of all of the other sort of more day-to-day things that a change in leadership or control of the House could lead to. We have seen this battle over Obamacare go back and forth. When it was President Obama that was president, a whole bunch, I think 60-something of these symbolic votes to repeal Obamacare, which of course we knew were never ultimately going to go anywhere. Now they can really damage Obamacare, and they're already doing it and making it clear that it should be a priority to try to save Obamacare to the extent that it can be saved if Democrats take over the House. Really looking into the policy and how to immediately affect change when it comes to the kids at the border. All of these issues, you've got to think it's not bigger than impeachment, because what would be bigger than that? But it's more immediate results potentially. And I think it's great that Democrats are planning this.
Yeah, I think that if Democrats win back the House in 2018, it's just going to be investigations galore for the next 2 years, and I hope that works out well. I don't know if it's the most politically sensible thing to do, but there will be two reasons for those never-ending investigations. One is that the Trump administration is full of cronies who are doing corrupt things that are worthy of being investigated, like, you know, this goes back a little bit, but people like Scott Pruitt and Tom Price using those private airplanes and on government money, or, you know, people who are supposed to be regulating different industries who actually have some sort of tie-in with these industries and are profiting from them. So there's a lot they can look into, like the recent New York Times story with Donald Trump and his financial crimes over the years. There's definitely stuff they can look into. I just don't know if it's the most politically viable thing to do. And also, Republicans, when they had control of the House and Senate during Obama's presidency, they also investigated everything from Benghazi to the IRS scandal, and it just went on and on and on. So they'll probably want to match that sort of thing in kind. I guess we'll get ready for it. We'll see how it goes for them.
Yeah, I would hope that these would be investigations by Democrats that actually lead to more relevant findings than what those endless Benghazi hearings led to, which was, of course, nothing at all. You mentioned private planes. Speaking of private planes, one place that the world's wealthy want to fly their private planes to more and more is New Zealand, because of privacy and the ability to basically just kind of disappear in New Zealand if you're some super rich person from somewhere in the world. People from around the world setting up these kind of bug out catastrophe cataclysm shelters in New Zealand. But there is now something happening that rights groups are not pleased with in New Zealand, which is that there is a New Zealand law that is new, which says that travelers can be fined thousands of dollars if they refuse to allow border officials to look at their phone unlocked, meaning effectively using your password or fingerprint to give them access to that. 5,000 New Zealand dollars is the potential fine. That's about 3,200 US dollars if a traveler refuses to unlock an electronic device so that the files within it can be searched, officials can also hold the devices, potentially confiscate them if you refuse to allow them to be searched. And the New Zealand Council for Civil Liberties is furious about this. They say it's a grave invasion of personal privacy for the people who own the device, but also everybody that you've communicated with on that device, whose communications would also be exposed, even though they may not even be in New Zealand. So I think that this is hugely problematic. This is sort of equivalent to a warrantless search. It's equivalent to a police search without a warrant of locked areas of a car like the glove compartment, although to a sort of greater degree. So on this one, Pat, you know, I go back and forth about the balance. As most people know, I don't think being on one extreme or the other ever really is a sort of productive way forward when it comes to policy. Sometimes I side with the need to lose a little bit of privacy for some added security, but I'm also very cautious of giving up privacy for the facade of security when it's not really there. Warrantless bulk NSA surveillance and wiretapping, we have learned, gives up privacy but doesn't really give us added security. I am sort of on that side when it comes to this mandatory examination of people's communications on their phones.
Yeah, customs in New Zealand say that it's really not a big deal. There's not so much to worry about because last year we only searched about 500 phones. Well, now if you make it completely legal for customs to look at anyone's phone, I'd have to imagine that number is going to go up, and it's going to go up significantly. And I also don't think it's going to be too effective, too, because if you are a criminal who has this incriminating data on your phone, there's a good chance that before you go to New Zealand, before you go through customs, you're going to put that information on the internet somewhere in a cloud, get it off your device, just because you're planning ahead. That seems a lot more sensible. So if we look at the risk-reward factor here, it just doesn't seem to add up. I don't think we're going to catch anyone in their wrongdoing. And I think while we try to do that, we're just going to end up limiting the rights of everyday people. And I don't think that's a trade I want to make.
No, and, you know, I don't think, well, let's take a step back. Do you agree, Pat, that sometimes there is a reasonable trade to be made in giving up a little bit of privacy for actual added security? Like, conceptually, are you on board with that idea?
I am, but I think there has to be a process, and that process is getting a warrant. That's what the Fourth Amendment tells us here in the United States. I understand there's a different country here in New Zealand, but I think there has to be a process first. I don't think that customs or anyone else should just be able to do anything unchecked.
I tend to agree, although even in the United States, customs does have
Yep.
certain rights in terms of what they're able to do in the carrying out of an investigation. I tend to side with you on this one, but I do want to hear from the audience about it. Seattle workers at Starbucks in Seattle claim that they are regularly suffering needle pokes from needles discarded in Starbucks, mostly bathrooms, by presumably drug users, as well as run-ins with HIV prevention drugs. That now, if you work at Starbucks in Seattle, you are regularly encountering these drugs and these hypodermic needles, and that the problem is getting worse and worse. And 3 Starbucks workers actually told a local news station, Kiro 7, that they had to take antiviral medications to protect themselves from HIV and hepatitis after they were poked by these hypodermic needles. I don't know if you remember, Pat, but I've actually told a story of a coffee shop in Northampton, Massachusetts, the old stomping grounds of the David Pakman Show that I frequent, which about a couple years ago put signs in their bathroom saying, "There is a needle exchange a block from here. Please go there. Don't leave needles in the trash can," which is an interesting approach because it's not shaming people. It's basically like a harm reduction approach, which is we know that people are coming in here, and because this particular cafe has sort of an open policy in terms of allowing homeless people to use their bathroom and even serving meals for people who can't afford them and coffee and so on. They know that people who are drug users are going there and that they are going into the bathroom and that they are using hypodermic needles. So instead of trying to prevent that, which seems sort of like a lost cause in the sense that you're not really going to stop people from doing that, their approach was a harm reduction one, and one of saying, go around the corner and drop off the needles. Apparently this is a problem in lots of parts of the country, not just Northampton, Massachusetts, and now this is a real thing that coffee shops need to deal with.
Yeah, and that harm reduction approach can work in Northampton because there's a place that you can exchange needles, around the block. But Starbucks are all over the country, right? And sometimes they are in rural areas and places where the attitude towards drug abuse is not so liberal. And I think it's just something that has to go hand in hand with the policy change. I think Starbucks knew that this was going to happen, and if employees don't want to have to deal with handling needles, they can either go to their manager and have them do it instead, or they have to decide to quit. And that's just something that they had to weigh when they decided to make their bathrooms open and available to the general public. It was a good PR move, certainly from the onset, because they faced so much backlash from apparently discriminating against some black patrons. But I mean, this you could see this was going to happen, I think.
Yeah, there is an intermediate thing though, right? Which is, and it just sucks that this is what they would have to do, but maybe there's a policy where Starbucks provides to all employees, for the purposes of emptying the trash, those really thick sort of like gardening type gloves, so that if you do pick up a needle or get stuck with a needle, it doesn't go through the gloves and you're protected in that way. I mean, it sucks that we're even talking about this, but that certainly seems like something that Starbucks could do.
Yeah, and the problem certainly wouldn't go away if they allowed only patrons to use their bathrooms, because I'm sure you can get something from Starbucks that only costs $1 or $2. I mean, everyone makes fun of their $5 fraps and whatever else they have, but I'm sure if you just get a small drip coffee, it's only going to cost you $1, and then you can use the bathroom. And, would the problem entirely go away? Certainly would not.
Does Starbucks really have dollar drip coffees? I haven't been to a Starbucks in like 10 years.
I have to imagine they have some sort of like chocolates in the front that you can just grab real quick. But yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe you have to spend a limited $3, $4 at Starbucks if you want to get anything. I'm going to have to look into that.
Yeah, maybe somebody who goes to Starbucks can let me know what the deal is with that. That does it for today. I will be back at our regular Boston studio next week, although we will only be at that studio for a couple of more weeks, and then the big studio move will happen. Thanks to everybody who signed up this week. Lots of new members. We will talk to you next week.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.